Welcome to our session, which I'll introduce in a moment. I just wanted first to reiterate the code of conduct for the Charleston Library Conference and give everyone a chance to read it. I'm not going to narrate it for you, but it is, I think, an important statement for all of us to share and indicate our support for. So, moving on. Welcome to our session entitled What We Talk About When We Talk About Scholarly Communication and Why It Matters. My name is Rachel Fleming May. I'm an associate professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Tennessee. I'm joined by two colleagues representing different perspectives on this topic. Brianne Dosh is the head of data and digital scholarship at the University of Tennessee Libraries. And Jill Grogg is a senior strategist in the Communities and Scholarly Communications Initiatives Department of LISS. So scholarly communication is a term that we use a lot. I was looking through the preliminary program before we started, and there are at least 8 other sessions at the Charleston Conference with scholarly communication in the title. It's one of the tracks for the entire conference. And of course, there are many people at this conference with scholarly communication in their job titles, including my colleague Jill. So the question that we're discussing today is whether or not all the stakeholders in the scholarly communications ecosystem use the same definition. And you might be able to guess that actually they don't. The meaning of scholarly communication really depends on whom you ask, and different definitions of the term go along with the different stakeholder groups. This can really cause confusion in all kinds of settings. And we end up with situations like this just in the literature. I mean, this is even like just an example of internal confusion from this article by Gorman and Rowley published in 2015. They say, as the implementation of this new model of scholarly communication, referring to open access publishing, has escalated, there has been increasing acknowledgement of its consequences for scholarly communication. So using the term in 2 different ways in the same statement, in the same sentence in an article. So I actually looked at this question using a formal method called concept analysis. It originated in the nursing scholarship. This article was published in the Journal of Documentation, and it's called Scholarly Communication, a Concept Analysis. What I did was I looked at core journals in LIS, and I used a variety of methods to assemble a set of core journals using different criteria that I won't bore you with. I looked in those core journals for articles that used the phrase scholarly communication or scholarly communications in the title and or abstract, published between the years 2007 and 2022. And I came up with 96 papers, all told, and I used those papers to do kind of a deep reading and analysis of the way that the term scholarly communication is actually used in those individual papers. And what I found was in the case of articles like the one I just showed you, sometimes scholarly communication is used in multiple ways within the same article, but certainly there are discrepancies in the ways that we use the term. I actually ended up coming up with a model for the term scholarly communication with multiple dimensions and subdimensions. I'm not going to go into all of those today because it's pretty Byzantine, I guess. But I'm going to talk about kind of the top 4: process, product, province, and practice. Those are different ways of talking about or using the term scholarly communication. So just looking at dictionary definitions, if we think about process, a process is a series of actions or steps taken to achieve a particular end or goal. A product is a thing or person that is the result of an action or process. It's something that's created. We tend to think of product as something that is sold, and often products are sold, but a product does not have to be exchanged on the marketplace to be a product, to meet that definition. A province is a region of activity, knowledge, or influence. We think of, province in a geographic sense, but another definition is just an area of activity or influence, or an area of knowledge or responsibility. Practice is the application or use of an idea, belief, or method, as opposed to just having a theory about something. Practice is the actual application of those theories we develop about, the best way to do something. So what does that mean for our purposes? What do these different dimensions mean when we're talking about scholarly communication? Talking about scholarly communication as a process is kind of using the term in the very most general, sort of abstract sense. It encompasses the work of scholarly communication in all of its aspects. Product refers to not the content of scholarly communication, not the research itself, but to the containers in which works of scholarly research are packaged and shared. That can be shared in exchange for a monetary exchange, or it can be information that is freely exchanged. Province refers to a field of scholarship. The questions and concerns, the foundations of that field of scholarship, all of the conventions that shape research as it's created in that field of scholarship, the practices and culture that are unique to that particular field of scholarship. And then practice refers to the actual collection of actions that scholars engage in as they conduct, share, and interact with research, with scholarly research. So there are a number of quotations that I'm just going to share with you to kind of illustrate each of these areas. And I'm not going to, read through all of these. I just want to highlight a few kind of points in each of these quotes. Processed in this first example, which is an article published by Boise and Schatz in 2011. They talk about how publishers are instrumental in the scholarly communication process, really not talking about specific dimensions or aspects of scholarly communication, but just in general. Gorman and Rowley, which we've actually already discussed a few minutes ago, when they're talking about product, they talk about research outputs here. That's scholarly communication as a actual product, something that is produced as a result of the work of scholarly communication. Wakeling et al. In 2019, in their article illustrating the dimension of province, say scholarly communication is different in different disciplinary communities, kind of referring to that individual culture within a discipline or within a scholarly community. And then practice, the practice dimension, Ye et al., this is an article from 2022. They talk about this concept of scholarly communication as part of academic publishing, formal academic publishing, but also the informal aspects of communication between individuals within an invisible college, sharing their research with each other. So the things that scholars actually do to generate and then share their research with each other. That's scholarly communication as a practice. So depending on the stakeholder group, one thing I noticed as I was reviewing those 96 articles for my concept analysis, I reviewed the entirety of LIS literature, includes journals that are more focused on librarianship and different aspects of librarianship, including information organization, licensing, collection development. LIS journals also can include those publications focused on the publishing industry, as well as those that are more kind of pure, so-called information science. So looking at kind of the different sub-collections within that collection of journals, I started to notice that those articles published in journals focused on or targeted toward specific stakeholder groups tended to use these sort of different dimensions in unique or interesting ways. So researchers, those kind of information science journals in which scholarly communications is discussed as kind of a collection of practices or a province, um, researchers really talk about scholarly communication as a process or practice. Publishers, on the other hand, talk about scholarly communication as a process and as a product, something that is exchanged in an economic sense. Librarians, on the other hand, definitely talk about scholarly communication in a general way and talk about scholarly communication as something to be managed, purchased, or provided access to in the sense of a product. But librarians also do create their own scholarly research. So they also may talk about scholarly communication in the sense of a province or as a collection of practices when they're talking about their own research. So, what are the consequences? You might be asking, why does this matter? From my perspective, it's important that we get on the same page when we're discussing scholarly communication because um, there are a number of consequences. Specifically, having differences of understanding of concept when we're discussing it has a negative impact on our ability to communicate with each other or communicate across stakeholder groups. This can have very real consequences for negotiation. Those of you who are involved in negotiating scholarly communication products on the marketplace need to have a cohesive understanding of what exactly you're talking about. And then in turn, achieving our collective goals, if we kind of keep in mind that ultimately we all share the goal, regardless of our stakeholder group, of um, creating and making available high quality scholarly research to as many people as possible. Not understanding scholarly communication in the same way can have a negative impact and actually suppress that goal. So Brianne is going to take over now and talk about scholarly communication from a librarian's perspective, and I will turn that over to her now.
Great, thank you. Um, so because there are so many different types of academic librarians, I thought it would be helpful to share the kind of work that I do and where kind of my observations around scholarly communication are coming from. Um, so if you keep clicking, it'll give the so I'm at the University of Tennessee, which is a large R1 land grant university. It has a student population of about 30 to 35K, depending on the semester. I'm in a library that has around 45 faculty librarians serving the university, and we do have a dedicated scholarly communication librarian that I do work closely with, but she's in a different department. Um, I lead the data and digital scholarship team where everybody, including myself, we have subject assignments on top of our functional specialist duties, like supporting data management and GIS discovery and other things like that. So this means that there is a lot of switching in my role between kind of wearing my data librarian hat and my subject librarian hat, which means navigating the many different conversations that you can have around scholarly communication. So these are my observations of the many scholarly communication hats when considering researcher and librarian priorities together. So frequent researcher needs and priorities. These aren't all of them. These are just ones that I have observed frequently. Um, but a lot of times, even though their goal is, yes, dissemination of their research and contributing to the scholarly record, a lot of them do have the really true pressing item of needing to publish on a 10-year timeline and publishing in meaningful publications. And what I mean by meaningful publications is meaningful to their discipline and those that will be rating them and ranking them in their discipline. And so that may not always be the most open publication. And so their motivations for where they're publishing can really be based on where they need to publish to get tenure in their discipline. They also have the very real need, especially at R1 institution, of getting awards, applying for grants, and meeting those award agencies' requirements. And a lot of times that does include disseminating your research and sharing your data, and also making sure that you're planning for that. So when they're talking to librarians about where to publish and how to publish and where to share their data, those are often the conversations and priorities that I'm involved in. And then a lot of times when I'm discussing scholarly communication with researchers, there are the time and money constraints when it comes to disseminating research. Um, the money part a lot of times comes from author processing charges if they are considering publishing open access, that they may not have budgeted for that if in their grant or the department or don't have the funds available to them. Um, and sometimes the time is a factor as well of where they're publishing. As we all know, the publishing process can take weeks and months, and knowing what timelines they need to be on. And if there is kind of extra work or something new they have to approach and discover, sometimes that can be really overwhelming to them when they're trying to navigate and get to that practice part of publishing for in scholarly communication. And so these are the needs and priorities that I am often navigating when I'm having that scholarly communication conversation with researchers. Next slide. Now, these are my observations of frequent librarian needs and priorities. I think if I were a collection librarian or an electronic resources librarian, I may have more like a different perspective. But one of the first things that we talk about frequently in the library and things that we're hoping to educate researchers on and talk to them about kind of that product piece that's important in scholarly communication is retaining their author rights to their published works and also thinking about like the copyright associated with sharing their works if they do publish behind a paywall, and being able to navigate that and educate them on what they are able to ask for. And it's interesting because I've run into that, again, those priorities from the researchers of needing to publish on a certain timeline in a certain publication. Sometimes, if the paper is out there, this may not be as critical to them as it may feel to the library. And what's interesting is there is a little bit of a shift around this when it comes to AI. Has the AI has been able to take almost all open access papers and use them and learn from them and train on them. And so that's been interesting to see a little bit of an uptick up in an interest in this priority that tends to mostly be a librarian priority. So I've just found that interesting in my scholarly communication conversations. Um, Another big one, and I'm not saying that researchers don't share this need and priority, but specifically in our library, because of our strategic vision and then also the field of librarianship in general, there is the desire to contribute to the greater open access, open data, open science movement, and that wanting to make all research as open and as available as possible. And the opinions of how there are certain ways to make that happen, which may or may not include um, papers behind paywalls. And so, kind of those motivations of navigating where a researcher needs to publish while also trying to maybe encourage them to publish more open access if it will still fulfill their needs as a researcher. And so that kind of goes into meeting the needs of the researcher. We're also meeting the priorities of the library. I find this frequently as a data librarian and a subject librarian that I will have a researcher that needs something that might be really expensive or maybe doesn't serve as many disciplines, and going to the library and seeing if we can get that resource for them and kind of navigating that process and also navigating how we've fulfilled the researchers' needs and priorities where they've published and that we can get there in a different way with open access and contributing to open science in a different way, but that we've had to work together to get there. Which kind of brings me to my next point um, of getting to the heart of why sharing in scholarly communication, like that practice piece. Um, and communicating around that can be tricky because the why for sharing can look different researcher to researcher. And so um, sometimes when you run into a no to engaging in more open scholarly communication is realizing that it's not a no forever and maybe making sure that you are coming from that place of understanding of balancing their needs and priorities as a researcher in scholarly communication versus kind of what the library and what you're hoping to accomplish as a librarian. Um, Also, the why in scholarly communication can really, the why can be the same and we can all be on the same page. But I found that if the how for sharing, especially when it comes to open access, if it's arduous, expensive, and overwhelming, you will lose people along the way, no matter how invested they are in open access. And so, where possible, when discussing scholarly communication and when discussing the open science movement, it's good to simplify. And also, what I was speaking about earlier is accept any level of sharing the researcher is willing to do. That if they've had any buy-in, if they've come on this journey with you in any way, that that is a shared success and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And so, what I've learned in kind of wearing these different hats, data librarian, subject librarian, navigating scholarly communication across different disciplines, is that it's important to not let your principles as a librarian, there's the field of librarianship in general, and then even where you work specifically, and then yourself as an individual. Um, for sharing research should not end up being a barrier to researchers engaging in scholarly communication just because they may have a different understanding or different needs and priorities around why they're engaging in scholarly communication. Because as Rachel was sharing before, is that we are all engaging in this shared vision of sharing and disseminating research for the greater good. And so it's just important. The nitty-gritty sometimes can end up serving as a barrier, and we don't want that to happen. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jill, who's going to give her perspective on the licensing part of this.
Thank you so much, Brianne and Rachel, for your previous context from Rachel's point of view and setting up the framework for us, as well as Brianne's interacting with her colleagues at her institution as well as researchers directly. I thought it would be useful to discuss, next slide, please, Rachel. LYRISS is the organization that I work for. It is a 501c3 nonprofit consortium or membership organization of galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. We have a little over or right around 1,000 members, mostly in the United States, but we do have a few international members as well. The majority of our members are academic libraries at North American institutions, particularly the United States. And we do a lot of stuff at Lyrasis. We are the organizational home for some open source softwares and other things like that. But I'm going to specifically focus for our conversation today about our e-resources licensing and open access portfolio. We work with a little over 130 different publishers and vendors, as well as a number of different open access initiatives and partners around the world. And we have some open access initiatives ourselves at Lyrasis. And the team that I work on, which is the Content and Scholarly Communication Initiatives team, we even have that concept in the title of our team itself. We really are guided by our values and principles, and we have taken time over the years to craft those, and they guide everything that we do. And I've included a link here to our values and principles on the Lyrasis website. But we navigate this space between libraries and publishers or content providers by leveraging the power of our groups of libraries who either subscribe to something or support to an open access initiative. So a little bit differently than Brienne, which is she's working and engaging directly with researchers. We do have some small interactions on occasion with researchers, but mostly we're in that space between libraries and publishers. And we have a bit of a broader perspective about this than an individual institution because our groups of libraries who either subscribe to something through a traditional subscription model or are purchasing or are supporting content through one of our open access initiatives. We have groups of 20, 30, 100, 200, 300 libraries. So we get to see a broad spectrum of different types of libraries and how they're engaging with scholarly communication on the library side. And we also get to see a broad spectrum on the publishing side because we're dealing with university presses and small independent presses all the way up to the largest publishers, such as the big STEM publishers, Elsevier, Science Direct, Elsevier, Springer Nature, etc. So that's a little bit about lyricists and where my comments come into play in this discussion today. Next slide, please. So I was fascinated by Rachel's article, which puts a framework around a concept that I had not genuinely considered in this way, that we're talking mostly about the same thing, but we're approaching it from very perhaps different motivations. So I just asked one of my colleagues, I said, what do you mean when you say scholarly communication? And I ask another colleague, what do you mean when I say scholarly communication? So, as a bit of an AI generator myself, I put together basically a composition of the quotes that I received from my colleagues, which is scholarly communication is the entire ecosystem, not just publishing to make content available. And you'll notice that I think this mostly fits within that process category that Rachel discussed initially. That's how we are thinking about it. We're not just focusing on the product, but we have to realize that product is important there. We're also focused on the larger process. And I encourage you to go back to your colleagues and have this conversation with them as well. It was very illuminating when I began to explain Rachel's framework and we dug down a little bit in our conversations with each other about scholarly communication, how researchers approach it with as a practice and publishers are approaching it as a product and we're approaching it as librarians as a process. It's very meaningful to have those conversations. And why is it meaningful and why does this matter? To go back to one of Rachel's previous questions, next slide please, is it has real world ramifications and things that we should consider. And Rachel mentioned this earlier about real world ramifications at the negotiation table because we have to understand and be able to have common understandings of where each one of us are approaching the concept of scholarly communication. Very much so when we talk about negotiation in general, I always talk about it when I'm doing presentations about negotiation. It's very important to understand the motivations of the person sitting across the table from you. For example, the person sitting across the table from me is a large scientific publisher. They are beholden to shareholders, perhaps. Their motivation is to make a profit. My motivation as a librarian or an intermediary on behalf of a number of different libraries is to make as much content available as possible for as little cost. So I have to understand their motivation. Hopefully, they understand my motivation so we can come together to some sort of reasonable compromise. The same holds true for the concept of scholarly communication. If I understand that the publisher is mainly focused on this as a product, I'm focused on it as the larger, general, the broadest category, which is process. That's important for each one of us to understand to have a successful negotiation. It's also very important for us to not to remove morality or value from each one of those two things, because that limits our ability to have a successful negotiation. Just understanding where the other person is coming from without assigning a morality or value to it allows us to have a more successful negotiation, both in motivation as well as how they are perceiving scholarly communication. The other thing that emerges here is the importance of agreed upon common definitions for terminology with stakeholder groups. We often see I'll give you an example. We often see the phrases corresponding author and first author used interchangeably. That's always not necessarily the case. Sometimes the corresponding author is the third author, the fourth author, the fifth author, because either their individual institution or their group offer, like something through LYRASIS, is able to pay for their article processing charges. Then they decide that the third or fourth author is going to be the corresponding author, but it's not the first author. And that can have real world implications as well. And there are a variety of different proposals out there for fair share of open access, and they may just be looking at the first author. And if they're saying all the time that the first author and the corresponding author are one and the same, and that's not necessarily true, we do have to have discussions about what we mean with these different types of terminologies. We also have shifting economic models with open access, and that's important for us to understand as well. When I talk to different librarians about, well, why can we not have all gold titles as well as hybrid titles included in this particular transformative agreement with a particular publisher? Because it's cost prohibitive, and we have to explain those different types of models, not only to each other within a particular subscriber group about what gold, hybrid, what our priorities are for those, but also be able to help folks like Brienne turn around and explain that to their researchers themselves. So it's always worth the conversation here. And what Rachel has been able to do with her framework is give us a way and an entree into having that conversation. So again, I encourage you to go back and ask your colleagues, ask publishers when you're sitting down at the negotiation table or you're having coffee at the Charleston conference or some other type of conference. What do you mean or what do you think of when you hear the phrase scholarly communication? Ask researchers what they think of when they mean that, because what we can do there is better understand the commonality we have amongst us and what our different motivations are. So that's it for me, and I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel.
Thank you very much. Here are just a couple of references, and these will be included in the slides that are posted as well. Thank you for watching our presentation, and we hope you have enjoyed the conference.